I don't know why, but it always cracks me up when I see people in the headphones. It just does. It's just fun.
Yeah.
So how are you doing? Where are you?
I've been in Portland, Oregon for 15 years, but no one believes me. So you could just say the West Coast.
Okay.
People have ideas.
Why doesn't anyone believe you? Why does Portland, Oregon seem like a very incongruous place for somebody like you?
Oh, they associate me with high tech in the future, and Portland is provincial and indie, and it's at human scale. So I live here just to literally for the lifestyle. So
I'm just trying to wrap my head around. So because you think people don't associate you because it seems anachronistic to the work that you do, and that is because, again, you have to forgive me. I grew up in England and in London, and I have this it's terrible. It's a very elitist kind of view of. So I don't know geography. I know sort of geography, but that's not like, people like say to me like, do you know such and such in outside of London? I'm like, no, I have no clue. Like, and I've lived in big cities. So the impression of Portland is that it's like hokey and like that it doesn't.
It's obsessed with like vinyl and old houses and indie bands and analog things. There's all sorts of film cinemas, for instance, out here. And I live up the street from a VHS rental shop. So,
brilliant.
I mean, how else am I supposed to do research if I don't have access to history?
Introduce yourself. Tell me who you are. Give me, and then maybe we can sort of get back into Portland.
Yeah. Okay. Hi, my name is Amber Case. I have a degree in sociology and anthropology. I studied cyborg anthropology, which is the study of the interaction between humans and technology and how technology affects culture. I wrote my thesis on cell phones in 2007, right as the iPhone was coming out. And I have held jobs as a user researcher, a user experience professional, a startup founder, and all sorts of research jobs. Last year, I spent a year as a fellow at the Institute for the Future, which has a 50-year history of predicting multiple futures. So I was actually trained on traditional futurist methods. I grew up on Star Trek: The Next Generation. I have always thought about the future. I'm a fan of Asimov and Ray Bradbury as much as a lot of other people, but also new perspectives from lots of different science fiction authors whose voices we haven't traditionally heard. So I'm really interested in the world in general. I've been all over the place. My parents had friends from Japan. They worked in the broadcast engineering industry and put TV on the air. So I actually grew up in a home without watching TV except for Star Trek. And I had the 1960 World Book Encyclopedia in the 1980s. So I immediately had this kind of asynchronous future in which 1960s did not fit 1980s. And I was able to see just how much changed in technology and then what universals were there like in the forestry industry that don't necessarily change. So that kind of off-centeredness, being kind of a time outside of time, even in our neighborhood and how the neighborhood was growing, that changed how I see the world. So I'm not really living in the present, I'm living in some coagulation of what people think of as the past and what people think of as the future, what the real future is, and what the aesthetics of science fiction have told us in film about what the future could be.
So, so all these things, I guess what I'm gleaning is how we think about the world is informed by obviously our experiences, the things that we like. And I think what you're saying, or I'm trying to read between the lines a bit, is that this, I don't want to call it nostalgia, but this sort of, I don't even want to say yearning because that sounds nostalgic, but like this thing about some of the things that we now call retro sort of moor you or give you perspective on how you look at the future, I think. Is that right?
Absolutely. Yeah, to understand the future unit, to understand the entire history of where things came from. And if we think about humans, we're just a tool using species. So we're using a hammer to extend our fist or a knife to extend our teeth. If those things break, we can evolve outside of ourselves. So really the nature of human history is geography based. What can you do with the things around you? What can you eat? What can you build? How do you shelter yourself? And that creates your culture, that creates your language, that creates your rituals, that creates your customs, that creates your clothing, that everything is about that. And so when we have a globalized culture in which we try to have the idea that geography doesn't exist, you know, we end up in a lot of condos, which are undifferentiated junk spaces in which there's, you know, there's no culture, there's no identity, there's no relation. Everything's kind of flattened and in this kind of globalistic sense. So, you know, living in Portland, Oregon is nice because I'm down the street from a VHS rental place. There's DVD shop. There's I run a cassette tape label out here where we make cassette tapes. And the reason why, I mean, it sounds silly, but the reason why is to be familiar with the physicality of technology, that it comes from somewhere, that, you know, to sit by a tape dubber machine from the thrift store while your tapes get dubbed is interesting because you can see where it came from. And so if we try to think about the future with a real footing in history, we can see what could happen, because at the end of the day, Spotify isn't going to be around. Computers aren't going to be around. We're going to have these shiny objects that future archaeologists, if we get future archaeologists, will say, look at these worship stones. They won't necessarily understand that they were connected to anything. So what culture is going to exist, you know, in 100 years, 1,000 years? You know, we'll have a bunch of rare minerals in shiny stones in a landfill, but books, cassettes, vinyl, all these things will actually exist, CDs even, and they'll be pretty readable, right? Vinyl being probably the most readable. You can put it onto a, you know, big disc. And then I'm really obsessed with the Long Now project, and what they have is an absolutely analog 10,000 year clock, where they're really obsessed with how do we work with the physicality. And I think it's also important to study analog things because you don't skip steps. If you're going to rebuild a car from scratch, you can't just press a button and have it change like we're used to on the web. And even deploying something on a server as a programmer, like you press a button, all these things break and you can't see them breaking. There's security issues, there's all sorts of things. But if it's a physical thing, you can see what doesn't work. And the reason why I'm saying this is that when we think about cryogenically freezing people, that's a very analog process in a way. And when if you were to resuscitate them, you have to really think through. And the type of mind that's good at operating a printing press, for instance, is going to think through every single piece of that puzzle versus having some very future-oriented software engineer say, oh, well, you just press this button and this happens. And I was like, well, I was just thinking, if I were to get cryogenically frozen, and it's sad that it's called being frozen because it's not a freezing, obviously. It's a slowing down of molecules. But my number one fear would be, I'm really cold when I wake up. I'm probably going to have a massive headache. I want to make sure that upon resuscitation, so much anesthetic is pumped into my body in a safe way that I don't, and then there's going to be all sorts of dysmorphia and like, what if there's an organ failure or something like that? So what things are going to fail? And I'm sure people have thought through this, but it's just an interesting thing because if you look at history too, you've got life extension all over the place. You know, Tale of Gilgamesh, you know, you have immortality. Yeah.
So I've got a whole bunch of questions and I'm going to try because my mind tends to jump all over the place. So you'll have to forgive me. But my first question was something that you said, and it's not that I don't think it's true, but I wonder, I often try and think of it through the lens of people like FM. I always fall short, but this idea that because, and I think it does actually speak to something I said earlier, because we want efficiency and because we want things to be quicker, I guess. I mean, it is efficiency. We look at suburbia, which is, in your terms, I think, I don't know if you said homogeneous, but this idea that they all look the same and there isn't anything. I mean, it does remind me of a bunch of like weird science fiction films in the 80s where in the future it was outlawed to, I can't remember what film it was, you weren't allowed to eat cheeseburgers. You know, in this future, everyone was really healthy, you couldn't eat cheese, you know, that was one of the things. So how do you, I don't remember, this is the other sort of question, but you gave me, when I asked you sort of who you are and what your story is, you gave me some of the things that you've done and some of the geography. But, you know, in my mind, as we think about the future, I mean, I think so much of it is about how we define ourselves, how we present ourselves. And then there are so many almost redefinition of terms. I mean, things that there are so many things that we thought of as static. I mean, the obvious example as it relates to the film is, you know, how we've even defined death, you know, in the last 50 years. I mean, we've had really huge leaps in terms of just the definition, never mind how the legal system and the bureaucracy and hospitals deal with that.
Well, there's a lot of things to address. I mean, first is the fluid nature of things. First, in the beginning, we never had black and white. We never had opposites. You know, maybe we had light and dark, maybe, you know, from the sun rising and the sun setting. People built their civilizations to be close to the stars. Astronomy was so much more important. There were ideas of immortality associated with that. We started drawing on cave walls. We started writing on paper. That was a form of immortality. We started to have dynasties. You know, we started to have. Do you have a dog in there?
Yeah, but she sneezes. It's weird as well. She's like,
I noticed. That sounds like a dog sneeze.
Yeah, it's very. Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know what she's doing. My daughter's trying.
We'll do another take here.
All right. No, you were good. You laughed in the end, but that's okay, I think.
Yeah.
So yes, we had dynasty. Americans dynasties.
Well, in the yeah, of course, but you know, in the past, there was family lines, right? There were tribes, there were lineages, then there were static tribes that didn't move and started to, instead of hunting and gathering, started to plant things, and then there started to be caste systems, much more intense caste systems, and then there started to be, you know, there was already the kind of colonization of animals, but it was always a side by side. It was, I'm going to work alongside an animal. Then it's, we're going to use animals. Then it was, we're going to use people. So we have, you know, everything's kind of a colony. And then my question is, are people more human, or are they acting more like insects? You know, we have all of these external components that we add to ourselves, like, you know, a beetle covering so that we can go down the highway into our own version of hyperspace. We have the space age, we have plastic, we have our spaceships. They just are two-dimensional and go on roads into the suburbs, into our little space capsules and our own settlements in the middle of nowhere. And this kind of settlement culture, you know, ends up kind of putting us on pause. You know, Marc Auger, the French sociologist, called it non-places, to be out in the middle of nowhere. I've seen French artists that had to move to like New Haven, Connecticut, draw pictures of the suburbs as a series of a flat plane of indifferentiated nothingness and a bunch of holes through which people were kind of holding their hands up and saying hi to each other. And that's how it felt to be out there, how far people are away. So you have that coupled with the idea that maybe you're a young programmer, you live in an indifferentiated condo, maybe you pay $3,000 to go down to South America to take ayahuasca to buy back the culture that you removed by your own programming abilities. I see this is somebody who's created these startups. And you want to be connected to something. And then there's a whole group of people that want to extend their lives forever. And heck yeah, I mean, awesome, right? Except, let's say you're 14, you have a trust fund, and your parents say, for your 14th birthday, we're going to give you life extension. How are you going to live your life? Who gets life extension? You know, let's say it's real. Who gets life extension? Where are they going to live? What are they going to understand as the meaning of life? Are they going to be happy living in a suburb, or are they going to move to Spain and say, actually, it's about having a farm for 500 years and making the best wine ever? You know, we laugh at romantic cultures, but when we're there, we travel to them on European vacations.
Do we laugh at them? I mean, I think, but they're romantic for a reason. I mean, I think like we can be cynical about them. I mean, they're romantic because in some ways there may be a guilty pleasure depending on where you sort of fall, but they're also this thing. I'm going to go and have a vineyard. That sounds very nice.
That's right. I mean, if we talk about FM 2030, he has this concept of upwingers and downwingers, right? Which I think is quite clever. Upwingers are, we're going to do everything, like Nicholas Negroponte at the head of MIT Media Lab, former head of MIT Media Lab, wants to push forward. Then you have downwingers, which are like, actually, we want to conserve the land and we want to conserve these old processes. Both of them are absolutely correct, because what we learned from the original processes works really well for the future. And that's why I liked, you know, Star Trek's perspective, The Next Generation, because you had all these people on planet Earth. You know, you had Jean-Luc Picard's family vineyard still going on for what, 300, 400 years? creating wine. Yeah, there's some robots tending the crops. Sure, that's fine. You don't have to have as many people working on the field. And then you have his kid exploring in space, like Jacques Picard, you know, like the Explorer family. And okay, it's great because both of them are harmonious with each other. I think there's this idea of like either or. And I don't think there's ever been an idea of either or. There's no, let's have the future. Like every time there's like a new technology like VR or AR, which is old, it's from the 60s, it's not even new. We think the whole world is going to be replaced with it. Now we have Bitcoin, everything's going to become Bitcoin place. It's like, well, we have credit cards, not everything's a credit card. Some is digital, some is physical. We still pay our taxes with a check, maybe. You know, we still have cash, we still have bartering. It's just one new way of working with the future.
No, I completely agree with you. I mean, it's untold amount of headlines. The headlines are, you know, are books dead? Or books, not even are books dead, books are dead. Oh, end of cable, end of this. It's always, I think this is the media's fault, really. I mean, it's like an all or nothing thing. I mean, it's the same thing in terms of, you know, I mean, maybe it's a sort of leftover of capitalism, or really just how we think of either predators or friends. Maybe it's that, but it really is like when something's, there's no, oh, we can have both. There'll be some books, some magazines. It is this very, and I wonder if is it sort of evolutionary, or is it just sort of the media trying to sell papers? Or
typically it's the media trying to sell papers. That kind of that kind of journalism works. Oh, will the e-reader destroy all books? Obviously not. Look at all the books behind you. Physical books are a way to immortality. Are you going to bring your Kindle reader to like an off-the-grid trip? No, you're going to bring a physical book. Maybe you'll even bring a sketchbook. Oh, will digital sketching replace all physical sketching? No. All of the best architects and designers I know they always do something on paper, or they go on a walk in the forest. And when they come back, they write it down and then use the computer as a tool to get them to their goal. So I think what we've done, I think in science fiction and the media, is we have conflated technology to this higher level outside of nature. And we've said, okay, the origin of humans and technology was just, it's a tool, it works alongside you. Then you have larger scale technologies like the cotton gin or any of these Manchester machines for child slave labor, right? To make textiles, right? And aside from making great music, because there's a lot of discontent, you know, that led to a lot of death, because it was basically harnessing people at scale. So then we learned how to harness people at scale in a nicer way by having social media, where you can just be chained into that machine and do all of the work for social media. But I think there's this idea of that technology is separate from humans. And I think that's where we get the issue. We get Terminator, we get RoboCop, we get the aesthetics of innovation, that it needs to look big and it needs to look shiny. And then we get all these unusable, annoying pieces of technology that interrupt us. Whereas we look at a hammer, and a hammer hasn't really changed in 2 million years. It does the same thing. And when you're looking at like a skilled person in a profession, a hammer is just an extension of their ability. And they kind of change based on the tools that they use. You know, like a gamer uses tools to make money, right? There are professional gamers in South Korea and all over the place. But they look a certain way. They look almost like race car drivers. You know, they've got their like logos and everything. They can only work maybe until they're 25, because their hand-eye coordination and their speed goes away. And then you have to work as a coach after that. You know, you've got a short lifespan. They're athletes. Wait a second. They're not physically moving. Oh, they are physically moving, because it all comes back to like the physical sense. Like everything we're doing is still rooted in the physical world. And so when we think that technology is separate from us, and that somehow it doesn't have to deal with time, you know, upload your brain into a box is the other form of immortality. It's like upload your brain into a book by writing a book. It's a pretty effective form of immortality. Make a family trust. Have a house for 3 generations. You know, there's ways to do it that we've used for immortality for many, many years. I like to read all of these, you know, early retirement blogs and podcasts. And my main question through researching them is, what do people do after they have enough? What do they work on?
They work on immortality on some level, don't they? When they have all this money and they have all this wealth, they want to actually have people remember them in some way, in some fashion.
Bingo. So they end up doing a lot of philanthropy usually. And they, you know, and a lot of people who are born really wealthy, it's mostly just social networking. They're just hanging out with each other and talking, or making big buildings, or, you know, making these world warping decisions. So are there, you know, let's say we had some immortality, we brought all these people back to life, like that would be really interesting. I mean, first off, like people would probably have to learn a whole new vocabulary. You know, would they even want to be on Twitter? You know, they would say, this sounds like, you know, they'd have a pretty cool perspective. And then the other thing is, would people take them seriously? Or would they say, oh, you're racist and outdated, we can't talk with you at all, without even working to train them, right? Because, I mean, obviously that's going to happen. And then, you know, are they going to have crazy trauma about it too? I mean, are they going to need to have like psychotherapy for being outside of time and jumping? Or do you make sure you have certain elastic brains that go in? I mean, it's going to be all over the place.
I don't know whether it's me, and it probably is, but I don't know if cynical is not the right word, but I detect, like, I don't know where you fall. Like, and again, maybe I'll ask you directly, like, in terms of the sort of, at least some of the questions that we were asking in the film, and then more broadly, you know, FM obviously had this very sort of optimistic, but not like, oh, everything's just going to be great. I mean, often people misinterpret like some of his sort of cavalier statements as, oh, the future's going to be marvelous, wonderful, we just sit back. No, it really was about people getting involved and advocating, and he felt like people would be catalysts. And it actually, for the first time in movements, in the Black Lives Matter movement, I've seen like exactly how he spoke about it, like that I hadn't seen before, which was no leadership, that there were all these people on the ground who were actually, you know, it was about the issue. It wasn't about, and I haven't really seen that without leaders in any real movement. Maybe the Basques, maybe, but I mean, that to me is really interesting, because, you know, as much as I would like FM to be right about lots of things, you know, there's definitely conflict, which is partly why I wanted to make the film, in terms of this vision and where we are. So where do you, I mean, are you optimistic? Are you, where in the sort of transhuman thingy do you fall? Like, give me a sort of sense.
Sure. I mean, most of the transhumanists I know have so much money that they can afford to take $40,000 worth of pills a day, whatever they need to do, or a month, sorry, not a day. And they're really, like, it doesn't matter. Like, it's important that people are on the fringes, on the edges, you know, the edges become the center. I also like all of the kind of biohacking types, like the grinders that are doing things with very little, because they might be the future of the pharmaceutical industry. If people can't afford pharmaceuticals, people can make them, you know, in their houses. Yeah, and they should be able to do that, right? Because we're talking about going from human scale to industrial scale, and then we're going back to human scale. So it's important to have a variety of people and perspectives. My only
the caveat that I have around that is I do think people should be, I mean, we're going to have access to 3D printing and be able to do all sorts of, we already do. I mean, you can buy an inexpensive 3D printer now, probably for $1,000, and print bracelets and plates and what have you. But I mean, the minute you start messing around with genetic code and various chemicals and so on, I mean, it worries me. I mean, I think that is a worry. And so I think people should, because they will be able to, but there needs to be some sort of regulation around. I mean, that's my caveat. I mean, I'm curious to know whether you have that same caveat, or whether it's like, do whatever you want in your basement.
I really think people should be able to do what they want in their basement.
Right.
I think it's important, because right now you have large companies that there's all sorts of regulated, unregulated stuff. People get poisoned, people get addicted all the time. People are making antidotes to that. If the companies in the United States decide to charge tons for insulin, it's a matter of life or death. absolutely, I'm going to go to somebody with a PhD in biochemistry who's making insulin in their basement. Absolutely. If it's between
And should
30,
there be any regulation around, should they have the same standards that the
no,
pharmaceutical companies? No, they should have
no,
no
it takes
standards.
forever. No, no, no. It's not about that. It's like, it's such a silly question because we have people making computer software with absolutely zero regulations in terms of security. And
Yeah.
that's choosing life or death. And for some reason, it's totally okay to do that. It's totally okay. You know, you can't build a house without an electrician working on your electricity, right? But it's totally okay to build a social networking software that when you change the group status to something and somebody gets killed by their own family members for revealing something sensitive about themselves, that's totally fine. No regulations necessary. Thank you very much. So it's in the middle of those two things, right? Because we say, oh, if there's regulation, it's inherently safe. Yet a lot of these drugs aren't safe, and a lot of them aren't even accessible to people. So,
And they're not, I mean, they don't even know how they work. It's some psychotropic drugs, for sure. They know that if you take it, 23% of the population won't be depressed if they suffer from, but they don't really know exactly, oh, it's such inhibitor, but they don't really know.
One of the problems with getting all these drugs from other people, the big issue with pharmaceuticals is that because we're like, well, we can't possibly know anything about pharmaceuticals, then we'll just trust everybody to make them for us. If you really wanted to, you could learn how to make your own, and you could look at somebody's process and you could be like, okay, your insulin process is pure. You could go in with your pH testers and your other little gear, and you could test somebody's process and you could take their insulin out of their basement. The assumption that nobody can learn how to do that, that no layperson could understand how to independently verify, and that it's up to you and it's your issue to verify that this is correct, and you have a network of trust. This is the silliest thing. Like, sure, you could put it on the blockchain and have all your trusted basement pharmaceutical people and have the trust networks. Like, in the past, we literally just trusted somebody. That was the whole point of a family recipe.
We still do. I mean, look at what's going on in terms of government today. I mean, well, we don't trust them, but we want to, or we feel like we should in some way.
Well, we trust them because lobbyists tell you that you should trust them, right? But I mean, the whole thing is like, if you don't allow experimentation, like if somebody says, hey, I want to try this experimental drug, and they sign the paperwork saying that they won't sue and nobody's responsible, and they die, isn't it their right as a human being to say, you know? Or you go to an island or a cruise ship or something like that where you try an experimental drug, you know? But it's really important that it's not in this ivory tower of these are the only people that can make drugs, especially if it's almost a democratized process like insulin. It's not that hard to make artificial insulin. It's not that hard to make a lot of these drugs. The process is not, like, some of them very, very difficult to make, right? Some forms of chemotherapy. But don't you think that, you know, it's so funny because it's like we assume, and this is not how it was in the past. Like in the Dark Ages, you know, there was this idea coming out of the Dark Ages into the Enlightenment that every forest house and every like female doctor was a witch, and you can't trust any of these herbal healers, and you definitely can't trust indigenous people, even though they've been, you know, helping people with local materials for a really long time. We're going to make the entire hospital industrial complex, and then and only then can you trust. Then you have all these people off to the side that have wacky, awful things. You know, but the politics around that are everybody who does anything off to the side is wacky and awful. There is some intersection of people that are doing something off to the side that are very good. And we need to make room for that so that we can democratize these methods and innovate.
Well, I guess in your analogy, the house analogy, you're right. You get an electrician, a plumber, I'm probably missing somebody, but they have to be like, I mean, I guess the analogy is, in general, you have to get planning permission, which is a drag, but you have to get, and the plumber, electrician are licensed. I mean, and I wonder, as much as in some ways, like I love what you're suggesting, I guess it's sort of the people that worry me, and in terms of what they can do and the sort of unintended consequences in terms of people doing experimentations or different things now in their basement or in their, you know, and unleashing terror and horribleness. So I mean, that's always a worry. I mean, the whole thing with 3D.
I guess you could get a license to set up a lab. Say, hey, I'm going to make insulin. Here it is. And then what are you going to do? License an insulin recipe from a large pharmaceutical company, and that's a way to allow them to distribute and franchise out the ability to make it. And then everybody becomes like the Uber of creating like, oh, what's your side hustle? Oh, well, I'm retired and I'm going to make insulin in my basement now because I got this kit from, you know, a giant pharmaceutical company. Yeah. That actually might work. That'd be fine, right? But
that's a brilliant new business.
Very important, right? Like to look at these in-between models and states, right? So first you say nothing's off the table. You seriously consider the idea that everybody thinks is crazy. And then you go in the middle and you combine it with another industry and you have an innovation. And then that's futurism, right? Like it's not about here's the future. It's here are all the multiple futures, knowing that every history is also simultaneously coexisting with the future. And then just make sure there's a diversity of thought and social class and all sorts of things so that you aren't stuck with a one-size-fits-all condo dwelling future, which is not helpful for anybody. And I definitely wouldn't want to live my life extended life or wake up cryogenically in a condo where I can't connect with anybody and there's only one little window to the side and it's just a view of other condos and I feel like I'm in a termite mound. Like that's not a future I would want to wake back up into.
Well, how likely is that future? As I mean, because this is all about odds. It's like we make one turn and we do. Well, maybe frame it in terms of the film. And again, the only thing that I'll say to you as it, you know, FM really believed that it wasn't just like we were going to have immortality or extended longevity or any of it. There were various things that needed to be accomplished before we could even, not necessarily think about it because he felt we could do multiple things, but there was these almost inner or psychological concepts of abundance, universalism, and this advocacy optimism type thing before we would get to that place. So, well, so where are you in terms of, what are the odds of this very homogeneous future as more sort of encapsulating universal, where do you mark these things?
We're at the most homogeneous future we've ever had right now. It's one size fits all, templated self, Facebook, Twitter, all of that. You know, so that's annoying. On the other hand, like, so there's this idea from FM 2030 of abundance. We already have it. The more you take care of nature, the more nature takes care of you. And indigenous cultures have always operated under that idea. You know, there's also warring tribes that have taken things from other people and larger warring tribes. But the whole idea is that nature provides that abundance all the time. And so if you work well with nature, you're fine. So all these companies out there that extract from nature, at some point, there will be a tipping point where they realize that it's so much cheaper to work with nature instead of against it. Not sustainability, but restoration. that will allow them to produce way more. For instance, you can make massive sustainable restorative forests, and it's actually really good for carbon sequestration. So there is a way to make things abundant for everybody. Sure. And there's been all sorts of scientists, like the scientists at University of Minnesota, that made it possible to feed the world. It is possible to feed the world right now. It is very arbitrary that people live in poverty, and it's kind of a political thing.
The other thing that's worth noting, which I did discuss with somebody, now I've forgotten who, and it was David Brooks wrote a piece, Upwingers and Downswingers, and referenced FM. And there's this idea, and you even talked to it, where these sides are opposites. In FM's worldview, I mean, he was a vegetarian. He was somebody who believed in global warming and the environment and all these things. So it wasn't so much the upwingers and the upwingers weren't nemesis, and it wasn't just, oh, here are the Luddites who hate technology and here are the people who love tech. There was a lot of nuance in this description that you would probably fall into not, oh yes, when the book that he wrote, Are You a Transhuman, had all these like weird like quizzes. You would probably fail some of the ones that about nostalgia, you know, how nostalgic are you? How much do you go to your tape recorder as opposed to your CD player? But you'd pass all the other ones in terms of, I imagine, your sort of social, but I don't think they're, anyway, I've said too much. I was much more.
Yeah, I think there's always this idea that there's this antithesis and an opposite, like the Luddites are against the, you know, it's like, well, all the people that I know that have made tons of money in Silicon Valley and have been the most high tech and the most nerds as kids, and a lot of times very indoor people, they have bought farms. They live on a farm. They're totally self-sustainable. They don't care about how much money they've made. They have a farm. I mean, farms are expensive. Farms at an individual scale are being crushed by larger industry. So it's, you know, it's not even reasonable to have a farm. But they want to have a farm because they don't want to live at a level of abstraction from reality that they lived before when they programmed computers. Computers and software and social media are just an abstraction layer. And when people retire, they want to go back to reality. They want to be part of something. And you know, the computers, they're all running on rare minerals that we use slaves to mine. It's not like, oh, wow, I'm so great. I'm making a social good company. I'm making a social good startup. It's like, oh yeah? What are you building that on? Physical slave labor, physical slave goods. You know, we don't talk about that when we do our ethical sweat-free clothing shop line, or when we talk about our, you know, identity politics on Twitter. Like, you know, there's so much more going on. But we've chosen, because it's very easy as humans to choose a kind of singularity of idea and to toss that around and say, well, we can only think about this right now. And then when it opens up, you can think about the next thing. But I'm really interested right now, and I probably will be for the rest of my life, in all of these classic Japanese ideas, like the idea of an actual cottage industry where an entire village can make ceramics for 400 years. They all sign the bowls with the name of the village. They don't sign the bowls with their names. It's for the collective. Everybody shares the labor in the village. They do specific jobs. It's all done from clay from the mountainside. That 300 years of clay, they have barely even made a dent in the mountain. And they're able to make distinctive pottery that's used, that's also can be used for 100 years. They have all they need right there. And there's a specialness of that in that you can't make those by an industrial process. These are hand pushed, these are foot pressed lathes. They're water-based pounders for the for the clay. It's all done at human scale. And if you were to repeat this industrially, it would not be good. Yet it comes out as this kind of artisanal handicraft between a master artisan and between industrial. So that in the middle actually provides abundance for them.
No, it's beautiful. I was trying to remember there's the monks make where they create this almost tapestry, like a mosaic, and then they eradicate it, and it's done as part of the ceremony. It's amazing.
Oh, the sand mandalas?
Yes, yeah, yes, thank you.
Yeah, I remember seeing one of those when I was like 3 or 4. I was just able to start speaking, and I asked the monk, I said, what do you do with this now? And she said, we're going to destroy it.
Yeah.
And I said, huh? Because I had watched cartoons, right? So you have Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner, and Wile E. Coyote gets like killed or destroyed or maimed every episode. Isn't every episode a sand mandala?
Yeah.
It's this repeating thing. It's like, it doesn't matter. And I was very upset because I didn't like the Wile E. Coyote getting hurt, because I thought, well, he needs to eat, and he hasn't eaten for 20 years? Until I later, like 10 years later, went to babysit some kids, and they said, no, you're supposed to laugh. You're supposed to let it go. They said, watch, just laugh at it. See what it does to your brain. Okay, I'm laughing. Oh, this is funny. But I was so identified. I was like, oh, look at all this labor. It's lost. It's like, no. This is the nature of time. This is the nature of reality. It's okay to let go. You know, I grew up without a lot of money, and so I have a propensity to hoard. What do I hoard? Well, I hoard data. I archive things. I ran a music venue where I archived the underground performers. I have the cassette tape label. I do these things where I'm trying to archive in a way that will last. But in doing so, I become more and more fearful that things will go away. You know, how do I do something of note to get into the Yale archive, for instance, right? Because they'll have temperature control, they'll have people that care. And really archiving is a mixture of temperature control and people that care. So the Egyptians were so good at archiving that they made these beautiful things that we have now preserved their afterlife for them. They do have an afterlife in museums. They are in temperature controlled environments, and they are living in the equivalent of palaces that people go in and see. So they figured it out. They really figured out immortality.
Well, they may have figured it out, but I mean, they're not exactly enjoying the fruits of their labor, are they? I mean,
Right.
you know, I mean, it's about enjoying it. I mean, this is the laughable thing about all these people that want to put their names on buildings. I mean, great, maybe people remember your name, but I'm not sure exactly what that really gives you. I did want to ask you, well, you still haven't quite answered the question in terms of how likely whether you're an optimist or a pessimist, where, you know, again, if this thing is even binary, but and how much of this future that FM sort of talked about do you think is possible, real? What are the shortcomings? What are the things that you hope for?
This future is based on the past, so it's definitely probable. I'm not optimistic or pessimistic. Everything has an optimism and a pessimism. There is no, I mean, in any of the meditation or Buddhism, like, or Taoism, it's like light and dark are just abstractions, positive and negative. Like, if I think of posting something on social media and getting lots of likes, the same feeling, it's just the same as I post on social media and everybody hates it. None of it exists. It doesn't matter. So for me, the future has nothing to do with positive or negative. The future has to do with oscillations. So, you know, you have this sine wave that goes up and down, and you have the beginning of the world in which everybody was very tied to geography. Then you have this anti-geographic push to say we are not geographical. Our albino species of English people has decided that we don't have to be in nature and we can have these big McMansions that eventually make it into the United States. Okay, palaces, things like this. Then we have these things that say, well, we don't want dirt, you know, except then you get wealthy and you retire and you go out in your English garden. It's beautiful, but like, you have to have nature as long as it's maintained, and, you know, no mosquitoes, right? So you have all these contradictory things of like, I want to live in a hut made of mud that's been around for 900 years. That would be my ideal architecture. I want to know the history of that building. I want to talk with the people with the 800-year-old building materials company in Japan that know everything about, first off, you've stored the history of all disasters in that timeline. I mean, that's a blockchain. If you're thinking about it, a business that's been around for 800 years, that's a blockchain. So do I know, you know, not to build above this zone because there's a 400-year flood zone? Do I know about earthquakes? Absolutely. Like, that's the type of stuff that, you know, the company I used to work at, Esri, which is a geographic information services company, like, they store that information and then you can solve for it. You can say, where would I build my house? But if you were part of a village, you would say, where would I build my house? And they say, well, this spot, because they know. So there's a knowledge. So I'm very interested in, you know, you have the sine wave of everything being tied to geography and having geographic history. Then the idea that you could just have a condo everywhere. It looks just like anything else. It has nothing to do with the local geography at all. And then you have the trend again, where you have a mix. You have a mix of all the stuff that we learned from this space age that we went into, because we are literally in the space age right now. We just colonized inner space instead of outer space. And then we take all of those ideas and we work alongside them. So suddenly you have, instead of these big tools that are produced at scale, you have smaller and smaller tools that are produced to work alongside you. So you could have a farm. You could have, you know, a long-term house. You know, I do think it's going to go back to human scale, because I don't think industrial scale is, but we're going to still have some industrial scale stuff. I just think we're going to have more and more of a mix towards the human scale again, as we see that condos and other things aren't very sustainable. They're very short term.
But we're also, I mean, I think this validates where you are, and we haven't, and it gives us an opportunity to talk about COVID-19. I mean, we're seeing the stuff that works is this sort of partnership between, well, would have been a partnership between the sort of global response, which has been less than adequate, but also the very local responses, which is, I think, what you're talking about, which does understand what's happening on the ground, can respond to it, and ideally would work in this macro, micro sort of, I don't know, flowing of information. I mean, ideally, but maybe you'll speak to that.
COVID-19 is really important. I remember last year going around Schiphol Airport and saying, I'm the only one wearing a mask, and I do this to protect other people from me being sick. You know, this is typical of any collective culture. You care about others. It's so easy to travel. I thought, it's so easy to travel right now. People are traveling for useless reasons. I'm going to all these conferences, which are nice and fun, but I'm really out of body. Everybody, I just remember the beginning of this year, everybody was pushed to their limit. We're like, let's see how epic we can be, how many conferences we can go to, how much money we can make. It was just this like fervor. And I thought, you know, this is unsustainable, because we have to remember, first off, that we're human. We haven't had a global downturn in a while. We haven't had the equivalent of a forest fire to reset our assumptions about what it is to be human, and to have this tide go out so that we can have more innovative, weird things. And in a boom, everybody makes the same thing together. You don't take a risk because you could get paid so much not to. People dress in the latest stuff, not a collection of hodgepodge they find at a thrift store because they can't afford it. And so you don't have a lot of creativity. You have a lot of industrialization. So I thought that, you know, things were overdue. And I was also researching various pandemics. Said every once in a while, humans get too close together. Humans go too fast. Humans decide that they have nothing to do with nature anymore. And when that happens, typically a pandemic happens, whether that's the Spanish flu or the Black Plague or any of these other plagues. But that really changes how cities work. We got foot pedals on trash cans and bronze handles on doors or brass handles on doors, you know, all of these things based on pandemics, getting people out of the slums, for instance, like in some countries where it's like, oh, we can't have this happen. We can't have this pandemic happen in Spain. We have to modernize, you know. We have to make sure that people can live at a certain level. So this is also a predecessor to any of the sort of environmental issues that we're going to face, where, you know, global weirding is that we're going to have larger scale systems that happen and more damage. If we're working with nature and we're building with nature, we're going to be far more resilient. You know, when a hurricane comes in and destroys a condo community in Florida, you know, if we cover up the wetlands, like in Texas, there's going to be floods. But if we restore wetlands, we're not going to have as many of those things. So this was mostly a warning of, hey, you're assuming, humans, that you can work outside of nature and nothing's going to get you. Here is the thing that's going to get you. You're all going to have to go inside and you're going to have to evolve. And right now we are all evolving. We are all being introverts. We are all thinking a lot more. We're a lot more stuck in our heads. We're dealing with depression and anxiety and loneliness and meaning of life and living with less and understanding what's enough or what's not enough. And some of us are drinking and some of us are drinking far less. But I think that's the evolution that's happening. It's like you all have to get introverted and get smarter, and then you can come out the other side and be prepared and hopefully have the tools to deal with the next step that's coming down the line.
So this is sort of an evolutionary slap in the face, teach us a lesson.
Absolutely. Yeah, you aren't above nature. Yeah.
Well, let me ask you a question. Not to this, you keep giving me lots of like incendiary, but you know, if it's true, and I don't know if it is true because I haven't looked at all the facts, but that it did come from these markets in Wuhan, and they were from bats being eaten, and these delicacies of these bats, which I think is, if it wasn't bats, it was this or that. I think that was the genesis of the outbreak. Now, you as somebody, and I don't know if you would define yourself as, I'm not going to give you the label, but you certainly believe in a free market and certainly believe in people doing old worldly things. So if they believe bats are delicacies, they should eat them, and if there should be a market. So again, this is a weird one because it kind of throws these different pieces of your, I don't know if it's your philosophy, but certainly things that are factors in how you look at the world. So Wuhan, people eating bats, created this disease, marketplace, tied with globalism, big recipe for disaster. How should they be outlawed, the Wuhan bat eating people? What's your solution? How do you put these pieces together?
All right, so it sounds contradictory, like an old world thing. It's like, okay, you can't just go into China and say, you can't have a wet market, because there's a whole group of people that they have no other way to make a living. That's the way they're going to make a living. The issue is when you compress all of these animals together and you treat them poorly, and you do it on an almost industrial scale using people as machine cogs, you get the spread of disease. And so having ethical standards, which cannot be really implemented for an impoverished group of people that have to sell animals like that, that's really hard. But if you said, you know, you can't just say, we only accept animals from family farms, you know, that's a very like Californian thing, that like, you have money to buy from a family farm. Wow, that's great. You can buy something at 6 times the price, because that's what it really costs. We are very used to having cheap stuff. We are very used to having underclasses of people. We're used to having stuff at the excess, and that, you know, that it's an eventuality that from any of those places, we would have some sort of illness like that. You know, we could have had one in the States, could have had one in any of these places, you know, any of these processing of animals. It's just, you're deliberately mistreating a bunch of species that you're supposed to work alongside with as a collaborator, and you're pushing them down. Same with people. That's why we have all these protests right now. They're going to snap. Either you're going to get a virus or you're going to get a revolution. The whole point in cybernetics is to let out that excess, to not ever have anything that's pushed to black and white, to not ever push anything to its limit. And right now we think, how much can we extract? How much can we take? How much can we work with? That's just not sustainable. And I'm not capitalist or anti-capitalist. I'm not socialist or anti-socialist. I'm more like, hey, the state of nature determines that if you push any system to its excess, it will stop. It won't collapse. We have all sorts of things, like, what does a global collapse mean? Oh gosh, you know, like, there's a lot of checks and balances in place globally to prevent this sort of thing. There's quantitative easing, which is going to result in all sorts of weird interest rates, sure. But really, nature is fine. Nature is totally fine. We're not destroying nature. Nature has its own feedback loops, and it understands how to do that. What we don't have is an understanding of feedback loops, because we forgot the origin of all this technology stuff with cybernetics, and we decided, because cybernetics now became a cool sci-fi concept instead of a real system of feedback and control based on nature that was developed because of anthropologists and technologists working together. So when we forget that, we end up going into, well, let's digitize everything, and we get into all or nothing statements, which are...
There's so many questions I want to ask you, but just in terms of time, I'm just going to ask you two, I think, maybe three, two last. So on this topic, there's tons. In terms of, I mean, there's so much nuance here. Genetically modified food, which again, is so easy to say, oh, it's all terrible, but then you've got people. No, but there's a lot, I imagine in the way you describe Portland, which sounds a little bit like Berkeley or somewhere like that, where there's a lot of people up in arms about GMOs, where when it is, I think, a lot more nuanced conversation.
That's the biggest issue. We don't have nuance right now. Everybody's black and white because they love, like, that's what social networks reward. So how we're getting our brains shaped is that our brains are getting shaped to respond to 5 or 6 types of content total, which is jealousy towards somebody else that posted something that you secretly want to do but gave up on as your dream, but you see somebody else posting on it on Instagram or Facebook and you get mad. Somebody asking a question about where's the local optometrist or a cool place to eat, which then everybody competes to answer the best. A third kind is somebody saying something that may or may not be true, but it's incendiary, and you get really upset for a while and you lose all your dopamine and get into a depressive loop, and then you spread because you're in your like kind of panic state, and you don't have reflection, and then there's the spread of fake news or the spread of incendiary news. An extremely personal sob story on your behalf that reveals way too much personal information that you post in order to get likes from your community, either through white guilt or through some sort of depression, and it's not real. And then there's a few other pieces of content too. Like I wouldn't categorize every piece of Facebook content, and there's just not that many. And so, but if you look outside of Facebook and social networks, there are a lot more ways to interact with things, right? Art is a way of interacting with the world. You know, going on a walk is a way of interacting with the world. So when you get compressed into these kinds of states, and that's the norm, we always think about these things and we don't respond to nuances. And nuances are where it's at. If we say all GMO is bad, we don't get the opportunity of GMO. If we say all industrialization is bad, we don't get the opportunity of cures and industrialized, you know, vaccines, you know. And we get, you know, the black or white thing that says all vaccines are bad, all vaccines are good. That's like saying like all food is bad or all food is good. It's like, well, there's a nuance. Like some food processes are bad, some food processes are good. Good and bad aren't even real. So like what makes sense, you know? Really it's about what makes sense geographically. You know, I think what really makes sense is eating bugs. I would like to have a bug farm in my room. I would like, if we're gonna colonize animals, if we're gonna colonize people, why not work with a species that's already been colonized? They already work in colonies. Let's eat termites, let's eat mealworms. They already live in condos. Let's eat them, fine. Lots of protein, right? We could feed people on very little. There's already people all over the world that eat bugs. You know, you go to Southeast Asia, it's like, there's bugs everywhere. You're gonna eat them, they're tasty, fine. And somehow it's creepy to eat bugs and it's okay to eat like a dead cow? What? You know, it's super arbitrary. All this stuff is super arbitrary. You know, it's okay to like have a bathroom with a toilet where it rots from the inside out instead of like having a Japanese toilet. It's, you know, it's okay to have houses that look this way. Why? There's so much excess that people are doing right now. And there's not a lot of clarity around like what people actually need, what makes people happy, whatever happiness is. And I think, you know, Mark Auger, who wrote about non-places, which all these condos and stretchy zones, wrote a kind of a sequel and wrote about the tiny things. Like, what are the small things in life? Like, what are the things you remember on your deathbed? You probably remember holding the hand of somebody you loved, looking into their eyes, maybe hearing a really good story from somebody, maybe a good book, maybe, but it's really about people. It's really about these really small moments between them, a summer day, a picnic, maybe a graduation, maybe a wedding, maybe. And so if we think about those special moments, how can we orchestrate our lives in a way that we can have more of those moments?
There's a guy we interviewed a long time ago. He's in the film actually that I think you'd like. His name is well, his last name is Hamburger. He's at the IDC in Herzliya. He actually wrote one of the original thesis on technology. I mean, this is in the late 90s, I think, on the implications of the internet and its effect on one's mental health. It's interesting. He talks about Chigami. I'll send you a video if you're not aware of him. He's definitely interesting. This relates, and it's probably the final question, even though I could definitely spend the afternoon chatting to you. Is and you can talk about this possibly, if you were going to have the ability to upload your consciousness before you could have some robustness to what it was, to sort of, I don't want to call it a holding place, but a place before you actually, what is it called, where you could have morphological freedom and become whatever, but before that base, and the environment in which you would be uploaded to, what would it look like, sound like, feel like? What would be the hallmarks of this digital place that you were going to be uploaded to before you were going to join quote unquote the real world?
Well, I'd want it to be at an art school. That's where I would live. Maybe industrial art school, something that it's going to be around for a long time, that brings in weird people. And I'd want it to be kind of a box. Let's say I had consciousness. And then the art students, I would be really kind to everybody and silly, and I would want to continue teaching. They would make certain armaments. So, one day I could just be put into a box and be a spider. Another day I could be a bird, and I could be in a quadcopter flying around on campus, and I could film stuff for them. It would be, because they're art students, they're going to come up with the weirdest embodiment for me ever. You know, I've written a lot of science fiction stories that I've never released, but one of them I wrote is two professors at a Ivy League school, and they both got uploaded. They were both celebrated professors because they've been there forever and they just kept going, and so they wanted to store them in a box so they could teach forever. One professor was really disgruntled and mean. One professor was really nice. The disgruntled professor, mined in a box, ended up just getting stored in a closet between sessions, and they just shut him down. The other professor, people were making all sorts of cool things for him to run around with, you know, from like weird cheetah legs to like, you know, rhinoceros outfit or whatever. And he'd hang out with them and go to bars with them and like have a good time. So really I think the moral of these stories are, it's like, it's how you treat people. And when people have enough, they tend to look outward and say, how can they make the world better for other people? And that's not like, I'm a nonprofit CEO that makes $400K a year and I'm making the world better by like destroying people. It's more like, you know, it's that nuance again, right? Like, how can I be content? How can I make it so that other people have more moments of content and they have what they need? And I think like also, if I were to be uploaded into a box, I would want to work on unmasterable things. You can't even use that word master, you know, because that's not even a real word. But how would I work on things that aren't accomplishable? You know, what takes 100 years to learn? The piano, you know, what takes 1,000 years?
It sounds almost like it sounds like a very Portland. I do know a little bit about Portland. I'm not completely, but
it's Portland, but it's also very Japanese. This is
no. But I was about to say it sounds like some sort of, I was going to say like Portland dojo, but there was another piece to it. It was a funny piece. Now I've forgotten. You made me eradicate my humor because it was a funny piece to my description, but you threw me, so I haven't got it.
Well, I think both of our brains are at the kind of ADD level where I'll say something and you'll have a thing, but then I'll go on for so long, and then I'm trying
to keep in my head like this. Oh, she's got this really interesting thread. Let me grab that. But then she said this, and that's really cool. And that reminds me of this. So it's keeping it all together.
It's very hard. It's difficult. Tough. It's tough.
Very tough. Last question, which is sort of a twofold question. Well, I guess biggest fears or worst fears about the future and biggest hopes.
My biggest fears have already happened. This is one of the worst outcomes that could have ever happened for the human species. It's awful.
Where we are right now. I mean,
absolutely, it's atrocious. We're making things out of plastic. We're destroying the oceans. We're using slave labor in factories, and we're not giving them any mental breaks. There's tons of people in college debt. You know, people are eating packaged foods and they aren't happy. People are on pause because they have to work so much. People can't spend time with their kids. People can't afford a home. People, you know, it's very class issues. There's so many class issues. Like, it's sad.
But you make it sound like it's worse than ever. I mean, at least
it's worse than ever.
Do you think it is though? I mean,
absolutely.
I mean, I don't know. I mean, I think
you're sitting here abstracted away in a nice place to live, right? But like,
I'm lucky. No, I've got lots to be grateful.
You're not mining in the Congo for rare minerals for phone.
But there's less people mining in the Congo, and the people that are mining in the Congo have, not to say it's terrible no matter what it is, but they certainly have better equipment, maybe some standards of safety that there wasn't 20 years ago, 50 years ago, 100. There wasn't. These people, if they fell, they're dead, finished. Throw them to the thing. That doesn't. I'd like to think that doesn't happen very much, if at all, today. I mean, not to say that these conditions are good.
It does. It's happening. It's happening a lot. There's, you know, but also you have to think about like the people stuck in a condo in Congo, in a different form of kind of psychological arrest, where they're with their own brains and they aren't connected. You know, the kind of Protestant disconnect that was written about in de Tocqueville's books about like, you know, and Emile Durkheim and suicide. Like there's a pandemic of loneliness. There's a pandemic of disconnection. There's a pandemic of meaning. I think people should be able to have meaning in their life. Now, when we see like post-World War II, you had a lot of people who were like pushed down and eradicated and saw their families die, make some of the best media we've ever seen, make some of the best art and culture, because they understood if everything's taken away, what's left? I don't say this being a person in Portland, which is why I should stop saying I'm from Portland, because it's a joke. But what's left when everything goes away? What do you have? You have songs, usually. Again, why Manchester produces great music, and why Switzerland doesn't.
Yeah.
So, like, think about it. Like, Switzerland, you do have people that have everything.
But it's a very homogenous society.
Right. I mean, right. So it's one size fits all. And it's great. The quality of life is really good. But where's the meaning? What are people doing? Or are they happy with that? Right? The most important thing is we don't want a one size fits all anything. And we want to have enough variety that if you don't like where you were born, you can move to New York. You know, that was kind of what it was. It was like, oh, you don't like where you're born? You don't like your family? You can move to San Francisco. You can move to New York. It's really cheap. It's really nasty, but you're going to be a part of people making stuff in a frontier. If everything turns into a condo culture, you can't move anywhere to explore anything, you know, and then you just have like an underclass of servants and then condo people. Neither of them are happy. I don't know a lot of condo people that are happy. I really don't.
No, I
yeah, it's awful. It's awful. Yeah.
So your hope is that no more, the biggest hope that you have is no more condos ever.
Oh no, I think they could be built beautifully.
No, I was joking. I'm just
but we just have to, I know. We have to learn from history, right? Like that Barcelona block that has a hole in the middle that you can park in, that kids can play in, that you have big trees in it, that every apartment has 2 windows, not 1 window like a condo, where light changes over time. Depending on where you are, the light fills your home and like moves over time. This is really important. The Scandinavians understand this. They don't have a lot of light. They paint everything white. They make their houses so that the light trickles through and they see a little bit of it, right? Like there's so much to learn from what people have done. And yet we decide to, you know, we have these people that like fund a condo from an armchair and reduce all the people into a spreadsheet. Isn't that just as bad as like looking at somebody in another country and being like, well, we'll just use them and harness their labor? Like, I want people to be able to be human, and I want people to be more in what the Greeks call kairos time instead of chronos time. Like kairos time being like the human time of watching a sunset, chronos time being like the industrial time of having a meeting from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m. when your wife just gave birth and you can't see your kids.
The passion and those moments that are so fleeting that we need to have more of. I mean, to embrace that life force. I mean, that sounds very nice. And kill all the condos. Kill all the condo people. Transform the condo.
Transform, yeah.
Transform.
You can't. We don't want to eliminate anything. Yeah.
Redefine what it means to live in the condo. Thank you so much.